is the Chief Climate Scientist for Fortescue. Following that, we'll have an opportunity for any questions from the audience, and we'd be delighted for you to begin formulating those questions now. Safe to say, both Andrew and Shanta very much like the more testing questions out there. So no softball questions, only the most difficult ones for our panelists today. Now, without further ado, we're delighted to welcome our third panelist to the stage. No worries. Please take a seat here. It's okay. Apologies for the slight disruption, but trust me, this is for the best. Dr. Fahad Saeed is a world-renowned climate scientist, computational physicist, and modeler who will, in just a moment, provide a further context on where we are up to in the lethal heat conversation and the science behind that. Dr. Fahad is based in Islamabad, Pakistan, so it really brings an additional perspective from the global south to this conversation. But Dr. Forrest, we'll start with you. Perhaps you might give us your top of mind on the topic of lethal humidity and where we are in the broader global climate debate today.
Okay, so look, top of mind, as I've been requested, would be this, to be brutally honest. Driving here, we're kicking around the fact that we will publish the experts' letter from around the world, where we've gathered global scientific academic research institution consensus that it's humidity which is escalating at a far rapid rate than heat, which is lethal to humanity and has killed so many people already. And therefore we have a current and real danger which is current and really killing people, and therefore our response as humanity, as industry, as governments must be current and real and equally immediate. The difference is, as we were discussing how we were going to get this out, is what would we title it? And we were thinking, you know, it's such fantastic science, it's research decades has gone into the presentation behind it, which just lays out quickly the enormous threat, particularly to the most populous countries, India, China, North America, and to their people and to their economies, which humidity is now driving, and of course driving people to graves, early graves. And would we say lethal humidity is already here with all the signatories on one side, or would we say, Sultan, here's the research you were missing? We're still trying to make that argument, because to have the leader of COP come out and say there is no science for the phasing out of fossil fuel, to support the phasing out of fossil fuel, we think is just unbelievable. And therefore publishing this letter in the next 24 hours, which has taken years to put together, 5 odd months of being on the road. You've got to actually see professors, scientists. If you're going to do lectures and have an impact, you've really got to be in person. And we went to all the great institutions who opine on climate change, on the extreme danger of humidity, to gather this global consensus. And the reason why we're doing it, ladies and gentlemen, is because we're not coming back anytime soon from the behavioural changes of the oil and gas sector, of the petrostates, including our own, unless we accept that lethal humidity is killing people, that the temperatures are rising at a rate that atmospheric scientists have never seen, that climatologists have never seen, that IPCC did not predict, to have several months of this last 6, mostly above 1.5, the last 2 above 1.7. And of course, in November, our first day at above 2 degrees. Climate heating is accelerating. So must our response, so must our determination, our absolute vigour in making sure that this COP is not a flop, that this COP calls for the phasing out of fossil fuel. And I say that because if I walk you through the hideous agony of what happens when your body cannot expel its 100 watts of energy. If you just think of an old light bulb, those old 60 watt, really powerful, got very hot. If you touch them, you'd burn your fingers. 100 watt light bulbs. That's what you're generating as waste heat right now as you just sit here. If you can't exhaust that heat which you're creating, then your body starts turning into its own oven. Now, you can exhaust that heat. You have this thermoregulatory DNA advantage, which is one of the most powerful, like your opposing thumb or your brain. To be able to handle all sorts of heat is a massive, massive evolutionary advantage that stops at the door of humidity. That thermoregulatory advantage switches off. If I can give you an example, can someone hold up a water? Has anyone got a water here? Or a cup of coffee? So I can take you into a heat chamber in Sydney or Singapore, and we can wind up the heat to over 100 degrees. And the water in this bottle will start to boil. And you won't be happy, but you're going to survive. Scientists have survived for 30 minutes in well over 100 degrees. But put a little bit of humidity in that chamber, and you're going to die very quickly. That's the issue. If you cannot cool yourself, then you cook yourself. And it's really unpleasant. Your gut membranes start to separate. Your natural flora in your body ejects into your bloodstream. You have endotoxin poisoning. Your organs fail. You have a range of symptoms which are extremely painful, which result, if you're in any way vulnerable, youth, infants, elderly, on beta blockers, antihistamines, any of the medications, not feeling well, anything which could slow down your ability to sweat. I've just described for you 30% of the human race. Then you could die within minutes. If you're fit and strong, you're going to die within about 6 hours. And this is what's happening to our world, and this is why I'm calling immediately for action. Why we've got to put down all the old arguments we've heard. We've got to have economic growth. We've got to do this. We've got to do that. Well, I assure you, they are not in any way denying the fact that the problem isn't economic growth. The problem isn't the world's right, and you're absolute right, to live the standard of living you absolutely deserve, to give your children a better life and a better education than yours. The problem sits squarely with people like me. And the problem sits squarely with the resource we lack most. Because people like me, there's about 1,000 of us across global industry who can absolutely make a difference and lead the world away from its fatal current trajectory. And people like me absolutely know we have the technology. It's a bit like the Model T Ford, but it's much better than a horse. It's a lot better now, but that is no excuse for inaction. The capital is there. We're directing at least $1 trillion a year, plus externalities of several more than that, into the wrong fuel, the fuel which is going to exterminate the human race, as opposed to a fuel which will save all mammals. These are the basic precepts, the actions which we now must take. I've asked every leader I've met to put down the old arguments, to appreciate that as a hard industry track record industrialist, with people like me around the world, we're calling for the best economic growth there is, which is investment in the technology and equipment we need to leave the oil, the gas and the coal in the ground, and capture the resources which dwarf even in the sovereign state of the UAE, absolutely dwarfed by thousands of times the oil and gas in the ground, with just what naturally blows over the lands and shines on the seas of the UAE. Sustainable energy. So, ladies and gentlemen, we're putting out a call by a global council of the great institutions from the world, from all the way from NASA to CSIRO, Harvard, Stanford, Oxford, Cambridge, you call it all, across India, the great industrial technology research institutions, educative institutions across China, Peking, Xinhua, all of these scientists who advise the President of China and the Prime Minister of China, who advise the leaders of the United States all the way to Biden, who advise the leaders of India all the way to Modi. One common call from us all. Now is the time to accept that fossil fuel must be removed as quickly as humanity can possibly make it. Now is the time to accept we must make policy which is equal to the massive risk we are in. Not, ladies and gentlemen, that we are facing, the massive risk that we are in. To get rid of all subsidies for fossil fuel. That is the biggest single hurdle to anything competing with it. If you've got government-backed subsidies against the industry you're trying to get off the ground, you literally feel you're fighting your own government, therefore fighting your own people. They must be phased down over this decade. That there is no compromise but to charge people for the cost which they are causing through a healthy carbon tax. And of course, use that income to replace the energy which each of you need and each of you deserve, but with green energy. You have every right to drive your car made from steel that did not destroy, with energy that isn't going to destroy the future of, say, the children you might be driving to school to pick up. The issue lies with us. So we take 3 steps today. First, the most critical. Global scientific opinion coming together, absolute consensus. So industry and political classes have nowhere and even don't wish to hide from. Second, politics. As each of those officers, Modi, Biden, Xi, have asked me, we don't deny our own scientists, Dr Forrest, but get us the support. Get it out there so we can make responsible policy. But we can't go unless it's out there. And third is industry. Probably the hardest of all, but for which Fortescue is very well qualified to lead. We're Australia's highest performing company by very many times over the last several decades in terms of shareholder return. We're one of our sovereign state's largest companies. We're completely switching off 1 billion litres of diesel, which we consume per year in 4 to 5 years. Not net zero, real zero. We're calling for these group of policies called positive power, and we ask you to also call for it, to get on that website, spread it everywhere, and say these are policies which responsible governments can take. And I use that word in conclusion very pointedly. It is every government's responsibility, first responsibility, to care for the safety and welfare of their citizens. If you do that, you will adopt the policies being advocated by the leading global scientists in the world and described in positive power. The world is waiting for you. Thank you.
Well, folks, you heard it. The time is now. Governments need to stop killing their own people, and lethal humidity is a rallying cry which we can all get behind. Thank you very much, Dr. Forrest, for those remarks and for being a thinker and doer in this space. That's a unique combination, particularly at the heights of industry. So we're so grateful for that work. Perhaps now we'll move to Dr. Fahad Saeed, who will provide a little bit more context on what lethal humidity is, perhaps, Doctor, as a starting point, and where we are right now as a world in terms of the risks that lethal humidity that we face in lethal humidity.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and apologies, I was a couple of minutes late because there's a lot of things happening in B1 where the negotiations are going on. So before commencing my note, I would like to tell you that why do I qualify to speak on this rostrum. So the reason is that I live in Pakistan, and as per the latest research, which is based on observations, not climate models, but with the observation, meteorological observation, Pakistan is the hottest place in the world when you consider heat and humidity, the combination we call wet bulb temperatures. So Pakistan is the hottest place where the threshold has been crossed more than a couple of times in the past. And we are 1.2 degrees centigrade warmer than the pre-industrial world. And the ambitious Paris limit of 1.5 degrees centigrade would mean that the countries like Pakistan would face more of such events, even if we do immediate climate action. So you can understand the scale, as has been put very ably by Dr. Forrest, that what is it in the making for people like Pakistan. And the second point is that I'm also advisor to the team or the least developed countries chair in my other capacity. So I can totally relate to what is heat, combination of heat and humidity is. And I have published a couple of study based on climate models on this wet bulb temperature. So I can tell you that just imagine that your body cannot shed heat. You're sitting inside your home, your apartment. You do not have the means to afford electricity, and especially during heat waves in the countries in the global south, the transmission of the electricity, it also breaks down. So you don't even have a fan which can cool you down. You just cook in your own sweat and you die before you are taken to the hospital. So that is something we are witnessing at the moment. And when we talk about climate injustice, so these are the countries which are what we call as global south, which lives around the equator, or in the tropical region. Those are the countries who have done nothing, almost nothing to this menace of global warming, these greenhouse gas emissions. But they are the one who are at the front line of this of this mess, and day in and day out. So we are not talking about drought, we are not talking about floods, which they witness as well, but this is the red limit to their survivability. So you can imagine that what one feels, and from my personal experience, like I can, while sitting even in Islamabad, I have a solar at the rooftop. So I can afford that energy, I can cool myself, I can even afford the air con setting in my house. But what about the street vendor, which is outside in the street? So when I hear the screams of that person trying to sell his good during that particular heat wave, I mean, and you are just helpless unless you cannot bring in 1,000 people inside your home. And the governments do not have the capacity to respond to that. So it is with folded hands, we have been requesting the countries, the private sector, to come up, because it is the matter of our survivability, and we must do climate action. And in order to achieve 1.5, we have to peak before 2025. We have to peak the emission before 2025. That is what we have been discussing across different themes within the negotiation. We have to lower our emission by almost 50%, the CO2 emission by almost 50% by 2030 in order to achieve 1.5. And we have to achieve net zero by 2050. And this cannot be achieved without bringing in the private sector into the equation. Without private sector, the science is clear that this is not achievable. So again, I cannot emphasize, and talking about the future, like I said, that in one of my studies, we have shown that the tens of millions of people will be exposed to these extreme temperature, the intolerable temperature, only in South Asia, in the countries of Pakistan and India and Bangladesh. So, just imagine that they won't be having any place to go elsewhere. They cannot, they cannot buy their livelihood. They cannot buy the bread even if such a situation prevails. And one more thing, that in countries like South Asia, even we do not have the database, proper database. If a person is affected during his at his workplace because or he undergoes a heat stroke, he was taken to the hospital, and in the hospital he goes into the registers as as a victim of slip. It doesn't even go into the database as somebody who's affected by a heat stroke. So since this is a new concept and the first time it is featured in the IPCC synthesis report, in the summary for policymakers, we have a figure about heat wave, and the first time of this wet bulb temperature, as the first time which it happened. So it means that it is a new field of science and it needs further exploration. So we need to beef up the science as well as the measures and means of implementation to safeguard the people from these extreme temperatures. And I would also like to congratulate Dr. Forrest for his initiative in this respect, because this is the thing which we face day in and day out, and this is our hard limits to adaptation, especially in the developing countries. With this, I would like to thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Syed. And in case anyone missed the crux of that explanation amidst the noise in the back, lethal humidity is the situation where it is so hot outside and so humid outside that your body cannot cool itself. That is what the doctor is talking about. You literally cook inside your own body, not because it is just hot, but because it is also humid. Your sweat, you cannot sweat, you cannot cool yourself. And as Dr. Forrest and Shant have explained to me on several occasions, this is death in a matter of minutes or hours. And importantly, it is a problem in the global south. It's also a problem in the global north. Cooling systems in the UK, we met in Oxford, we were talking about cooling systems in the UK, nowhere near up to scratch to deal with that situation. It becomes, as Dr. Forrest describes it, a mass casualty event, and that's why it's a here and now problem. Now, Dr. Shatabali, I mean, you, alongside Dr. Forrest, have taken the concept of the wet bulb effect and turned it into lethal humidity, and you're being a part of this long exposition across the world on that topic. Can you tell us a little bit more about why this is so important in the context of Fortescue and your work?
I can, and I'll maybe sit here. So I think for me, what was very powerful, and to all of us actually, and possibly to everyone who's hearing about this for the first time, it's the idea that humanity has an upper limit to survival. I'm a biologist, but I didn't really think there was a sort of hard end to survival that was created by heat when it combines with humidity. So when we first encountered this topic, we were quite skeptical of it, to be honest, and just thought, no, that's not possible. Surely humans will just adapt and overcome this new challenge. And then we looked more and more into literature, which really started to emerge in 2010, and realized that actually there is a hard line, which is created by temperatures that aren't that extreme, around 30 to 35 degrees, that's not too much. When combined with very, very high humidity, that's the point at which your sweat stops evaporating. It's a physical challenge to your sweat evaporating, and then you can't shed all this heat that you're constantly burning. So we went from, this can't possibly be true, to, oh, wow, and then we realized that, because there was a paper published in 2020 by NASA scientists, which actually showed that while climate models had predicted these conditions, these lethal conditions, would only happen mid-century, they were actually already here on Earth. And you can see on this map all the red dots scattered around. They're in the tropics, they're in the subtropics. And as temperatures rise, they expand to other new areas. And the thing about lethal humidity, because we're not here to talk science, as you may have noticed, we're here to change policy using science. The thing about lethal humidity is that, unlike other impacts of climate change, it's not like just this little bit of the world, just that person. It's going to be a common denominator that impacts India, China, America, the Midwest of America, which Northern Australia. In the Midwest, hundreds of cattle died in August. And it was actually the farmers of the Midwest, you can Google this, who came out and said, heat and humidity has killed our cattle, and normally, it's totally unprecedented. Normally, it only kills the biggest cattle. In this case, it was the small ones dying as well. That's how devastating it was. So it's a common denominator threat, and the IPCC actually published this in the latest synthesis report as a near-term threat under 1.5 degrees. And as we all know, we're at 1.5 degrees, basically. So it's here. And I just want to address quickly, a question we often get is, what's the link between global warming and humidity? So yes, your lakes and your rivers are going to dry up in some parts of the world because of climate change. But if you look at the ocean, it's this almost infinite source of water that is getting hotter and hotter and hotter, particularly this year. You're getting a lot more evaporation, and that humidity is going into the air. A lot of it's not reaching that far inland, but the absolute amount of humidity in the air, the amount of water in the air, has gone up, and it's particularly increasing in India and across Europe and Asia. So that's the second point. And then my last point is something that Andrew touched on, which is that a large fraction of the population is already vulnerable. But again, the interesting thing about lethal humidity isn't that it's, normally like COVID, people with underlying conditions, the elderly, yes, that's normal. They're usually the first to die when there's some horrible threat, right? But in this particular case, it's also the young, because they work outdoors often. So workers in construction sites, young, healthy men and women are also extremely exposed, because they're the ones who, to make their living, need to go out and stand on top of a scaffold in extreme heat and humidity. And we're already seeing examples of that in America, of fatalities. So, yeah, I think I don't think I can add anything further on top of what's been said.
Thank you, Dr. Bali. And those last comments on the inequality aspects of this remind me of something that a colleague, Dr. Ben Jones at Oxford, explained to us. He looks at Indigenous communities in far northern Australia, and he was talking about how so many of the diseases that most contribute to the health gap in Australia between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples is to do with diseases that are exacerbated by humidity. So it's not just the immediate death at lethal humidity, but also all of the additional complications that come as we grow closer and closer to that point. Now, the one topic we haven't spoken at length on is the Lethal Humidity Global Council. I just wonder, Andrew, if you might explain to us what that is and why you've put it together.
Okay, thank you. So the Lethal Humidity Global Council are professors of appropriate sciences, could be medical, could be climate, could be atmospheric, who have all bound together in one group called the Lethal Humidity Global Council. And they come, as I mentioned in my talk, from the variety of the most leading institutions in the United States, India, North America. That's been our primary target, but also Europe, Latin America, Australia. And each of these individuals have been prepared to stand up and be named as full supporters of the 100-odd clickbait, but very deeply scientifically researched presentation and a letter which went to leaders. And because, as I have mentioned, the officers and the leaders themselves know that the letter was coming, and they know that it's not America trying to preach to China or China trying to preach to India. It's their scientists telling them what they should do because of absolute observing fact. It's very difficult to negotiate with anyone who's a bit of a blockhead on science if it's predictive. They can argue, well, that's just what scientists think. You know, I'm not going to cop that. And we've seen a lot of that emerge in politics, particularly under the Trump era. Where that conversation stops is when the science switches from predictive to observing. You're just observing. You can go to see the hospitals, you can go and see the morgues. We're not arguing with anyone who's saying it's here. And the power of these scientists all coming together as one voice is that they're describing absolute fact on observing science. And therefore, there must be absolute action. That's that group.
Fantastic, thank you very much. And it's also important to say that the folks on the stage here are just a small sample of the rich diversity of opinion that is on that council. Not diversity of opinion in terms of not agreeing, everyone is aligned 100%, but just diversity of background, I mean to say. We now have an opportunity for a few brief questions. I might take 3 at once, and we'll go down the panel, and then we'll have to close up. So perhaps number 1 here, number 2 in the back. Do we have a third? Number 3, perfect.
Hi, thanks. Zach Coleman with Politico. You can tell my accent. I'm from the States. Just wanted to ask about the response of Australia on clean energy. The U.S. obviously have its Inflation Reduction Act. It's a bit of a divisive policy at home politically, but there is also a push for clean energy subsidies in Australia. Is that necessary for Australia to compete with the U.S. and compete in this global clean energy market?
My name's Jenny Selway. I'm the CEO of Hilt CRC, and Fortescue is one of our core members in Hilt that focus on decarbonisation of heavy industry. So I'm really passionate about doing everything we can to decarbonise heavy industry because of climate change. One thing I find quite often in the discussions is people forget sometimes why we're doing this, and that's why I really appreciate everything that's been said on the panel here. I was wondering if you have any advice for communication techniques when you're talking to a broad base of stakeholders, to how to bring it back to why we're doing all of this so it doesn't get forgotten, because I find that's something I have to face quite a lot in my role.
Thank you. Just related to the first question, but an extension, how do you make the policies politically agnostic? So you have a change in administration in the US, and then they wind back the IRA.
Thank you for 3 excellent questions. Perfect, Dr. Forrest then.
Okay, just on the IRA. To be really blunt, the cost to the American taxpayer is pretty illusory. I mean, we've got very senior political leaders in the room here. I mean, if you're creating a credit on an industry and an income you don't have, right? It's out there. It doesn't even exist. You say, well, if you create this credit, which the whole country's going to win from, if this industry, which the whole country's going to win from, then we're going to give you a tax credit, which we don't have yet because you haven't yet created it. So it's literally monopoly money, but it actually works to incentivize people. So for the Republicans who really don't understand it, I'd say just take a basic lesson in economics, the most basic you can get, and there's a thing called the multiplier effect. Now, I had a very serious discussion with a very animated, argumentative president. I can assure you in person, President Biden does get really wound up. He can be really front foot. And I was able to make the point, which was accepted, that if you are making an investment which repays itself, taxes, economic growth, everything you need in countries, every 3 to 5 years, then that beats the hell out of Warren Buffett's miracle of 9%. This is a miracle of 20+%. And you should not cap it. If it's repaying itself, every time you put $1 in, it repays itself within 3 to 5 years, keep putting it in. I mean, we just can't get investments like that around the world. That is why the IRA is such an economy builder, the most effective economic policy to build an economy that the United States has had in decades. So if you want to wind that back, let's just vote for austerity, vote for a lower standard of living, vote for higher pollution, vote for really screwing your kid's life. I mean, that's what you do if you advocated the removal of the IRA just because you can sow fear into a community, then exploit it. And that is what I'd say, whenever you see that, then you know you're not talking any real leadership at all. You know that leader has discarded their principal responsibility, which is to care for the welfare and survivability of their citizens. So I do say to Republican politicians when they argue with me, I say, well, I'll take you to the morgues. I'll take you to the hospitals. Let's not dick around saying who's right and who's wrong. Let's just see the people dying or people who have died. And that is working. And so when you talk about cut-through of messaging, I just say we rely on absolute fact, but the expert here is Shantabali.
No, I was going to say, you probably know the answers to this, but for us, it's basically a fireable offence to go to Andrew with anything that is past 2030, because if you push it beyond 2030, it basically means you're not trying, because we have to be doing it now, and it has even this year is beyond this year too far away. And global warming and the climate crisis for too long has talked about what's going to happen, and it's now in our language. It's like second habit, isn't it? To say the problems we're facing or the looming crisis, but we're actually in it. And the most important thing we think that we can do is to talk about the impacts now, and that's why lethal humidity is what we think the most powerful example of the climate crisis, because it's happening right now and it's killing people across the world. Yeah, I'd say that's the most important thing.
Do you want to make a comment about it?
No. Is it working? So, no, about that, of the communication. So, of course, it is extremely important. So, just from my own experience, so last year we had a record-breaking heat wave in India and Pakistan. And, then this point of this wet bulb temperature, the combination of heat and humidity, that pops up from nowhere. People started asking about this particular phenomena. So despite my limited abilities to eloquently communicate myself, so I was in the in the media, in the English media, because to defending our position from Pakistan and from South Asia, letting people know. So nobody can root more than me for the communication. It is extremely important. We are witnessing it day in and day out. So yeah, of course it is very important, and we must think of new ways of communicating this message at the global stage.
Thank you so much to the panelists. I didn't introduce myself at the beginning. That was actually intentional to not distract from these folks. But I'm going to introduce who I am for one comment in relation, because I think it's important. I'm Dr. Brian O'Callaghan. I lead a program at the University of Oxford to understand the economic characteristics of green investment. And I also am an investor in the US using the IRA tax credits. And what I can tell you is, part one, this economic multiplier is so incredibly powerful. It is literally 3 to 4 times money in, money out. For the tax office, you make more money over the long term because of the new taxes that come out of the additional economic productivity that you create through that. So that's absolutely true. And what we've seen to be particularly powerful is the way in which it leverages the entirety of the US corporate balance sheet that it has a tax liability for climate change. So if you are a Google, if you are an Amazon, your tax liability can be invested straight into renewables instead of into the tax system. So there's an incredible amount of power there. And to the Republicans' point, do you know that 85% of the economic benefit of the IRA so far has been in red districts and counties? And 72% of job creation has been in red districts and counties. So to the point on whether this has long-term legs, I certainly think that it does. But these opinions and those of all that have been shared today are so appreciated in broader context of climate change and lethal humidity. Thank you to everyone here for participating so actively in the conversation. We're really grateful to you for coming around. And please, let this term, lethal humidity, come into your normal dialogue. Tell other folks about it. And follow the Fortescue pages to understand a little bit more. I think there'll be some in the press relatively soon. So thank you to our panelists. Thank you to the audience.